Licensing contracts. Neil is a partner and chairman of the corporate department at Abrams, Fensterman, Eisman, Formato Ferreira, and Wolf LLP. Mr. Kaufman represents public companies, private companies, and investment firms in corporate securities, financing, borrowing, merger and acquisition, and other legal matters. His clients range from early-stage growth companies to mature public companies across a wide range of industries, including software, internet, manufacturing, distribution, and services. He is well known for advising clients with respect to SEC regulation, public offerings, private placements, and mergers and acquisitions, as well as all types of commercial contracts. Mr. Kaufman, a frequent speaker on legal subjects, is also chairman of the Long Island Capital Alliance, a director of the Long Island chapter of Financial Executive International, a member of the corporate advisory board of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and formerly served as chairman of the board of directors of Visicom Incorporated, in addition to sustaining many other affiliations. Mr. Kaufman, please.
Thank you very much, Larry and CEWIT and CEWIT and Stony Brook University for having me here this morning and for that nice introduction. So Larry's right. Generating revenues and making a business successful through licensing agreements is one alternative, although it's not mutually exclusive with raising capital and building a business independently. I want to thank previous speakers for covering those topics so well, Alon and Roy. Those were great presentations. Living in that world, it's very hard to distill it down to a few minutes, so I feel for you. So there's a lot of content to talk about with licensing agreements. I think you've seen a little bit of it earlier, and we're going to run a little bit out of time. As the last person standing here between you guys and lunch, I don't want to run late for you. What can be licensed? Patents, trademarks, copyrights, all kinds of intellectual property. I'm not going to go through the details about what that is. I think you heard a little bit about that earlier. What I'm going to try to cover this morning is how to go about licensing in general, key agreements with licensing issues, and if we have time, cover software as a service agreements because that's increasingly prevalent and has its own set of issues. So, like I said, you can license the major types of intellectual property. What is a license? Well, it's a grant of permission by the owner of a set of intellectual property to someone else to exploit that intellectual property. And I may shorten that to IP because it's too many syllables for me to keep saying. Without that grant of a license, the use by the licensee would constitute infringement, and the owner of the IP would have the right to claim damages. Keep in mind, the licensor, the owner of the IP, retains legal and beneficial ownership of the IP at all times. That better be clear in your license agreement. It's not the same thing as a transfer or an assignment of the IP, and people get confused about that all the time. I don't know why, but they do. So why would you choose to license your IP as opposed to going off and raising capital and building an independent company? Again, not they're mutually exclusive, but there are a bunch of considerations. For starters, if you develop some really cool technology, for example, but you're not in the business of manufacturing widgets and that's what your technology is going to be usable for, well, it might make sense to license that technology to a widget manufacturer who can more readily use it, and that has the added bonus of generating immediate revenue for your business or yourself if you own it personally. You may not have, especially with the early stage companies here, you may not have the resources to fully develop a product or fully exploit a technology. You may not have a full grasp of the market. You may not want to be a full service company. So those are all good reasons if you can generate a significant licensing revenue stream to go that route. In addition, sometimes the technology that you've developed works best when combined with an already existing technology, and so there's a ready market for someone to use it perhaps more efficiently than you can and allow you to generate more revenue from it. So what are some of the key issues and common contractual terms with respect to license agreements? Well, the first thing is the grant of the license, and you better be really clear about exactly what you're granting a license on and exactly for what purposes, and make it clear what the scope of the permitted use of the licensed technology is, any geographical territorial limitations. That has to be very clear. Again, it's amazing how many times I see license agreements that are drafted incredibly amorphously that just give rise to lawsuits. So the grant should address a lot of things like who's the licensor, who's the licensee, what is being licensed, what rights does the licensee have, and we'll talk about some of these other terms in a minute. We've kind of addressed that. So different intellectual property requires different language in the license agreement as to the scope of the grant. For patents, it's generally the right to use, make, or sell a product utilizing the patented technology. For trademarks, it's the right to use that mark or that brand in connection with specified goods and services and the right to advertise and display it. And for copyrights, it's the right to use and reproduce, but generally not to amend or modify, and also the right to translate. One of the key issues we face with license agreements is exclusivity. That's often the first major issue we confront. In other words, if you own some IP and you're going to license it to a third party, is that third party going to be the only licensee or one of many? So there are a lot of considerations to take into account in making that decision. For example, if you're going to grant an exclusive license, that means you're banking on that licensee to generate your revenue stream. Typically, you need that licensee to then commit a certain level of effort and expenditure to developing the product and marketing and selling it. Oftentimes, minimum requirements, minimum royalty requirements are imposed, minimum effort requirements, and if those requirements are not achieved, the license can either lapse or become non-exclusive and allow you to license it out to additional third parties. Now, non-exclusive licenses can be granted. Keep in mind, though, an exclusive licensee has a lot bigger incentive to spend money and time and effort to generate a larger market and revenues of the product using your licensed technology. So that tends to gravitate towards a decision to grant an exclusive license. On the other hand, if you're not comfortable with that, or if there's no party out there that you're willing to bank on to fully come through for you, or if you think that your technology has such broad use that you want to be free to license it to multiple parties, and economics may dictate that. Maybe you just can't generate enough revenue through one exclusive license, especially if there are, in a fragmented industry where there might be many users for it. So you grant a non-exclusive license. The risk there is that as one of many licensees, none of them have a particularly strong effort to blow out the use of your technology, but if what you've developed is essential to a particular industry, they're all going to use it anyway. And they're going to pay you royalties. And that's the main reason why you do a license, is to make the money, right? I mean, so a lot of hands went up in terms of entrepreneurs in this audience, and I'm sure some of you have developed some software, some other kind of technology, and if you want to monetize that, you face the great decision. Do you go the raise money, build a company, hire a management team route that we were talking about earlier, or you license it out, you get a royalty. Now, royalties are usually calculated based on net revenues, which is essentially top line revenues. And one of the key questions is, well, how do I figure out what the right royalty amount is? And it's a tough thing to do. It varies considerably. What I've found over the years is that for strongly proprietary IP, you try to estimate the royalty calculated based on net revenues as a derivation of how much profit will be generated by the licensee using that licensed technology. So again, for strongly proprietary IP, the licensor might get a royalty that works out to about 1/4 to 1/3 of the profit on the product sold using the licensed technology, or at least the profit attributable to that licensed technology. That varies widely though. That could be much less for weak IP or for a trademark that you're licensing, but it's not really critical to the success of the product. Royalties typically are paid quarterly or annually, usually I see quarterly, and generally are subject to an annual audit. So if you as the licensor think that the licensee didn't pay you enough, didn't calculate your royalties correctly, you generally have the right to go in there and audit the calculation of the royalties, sometimes limited to once a year. And usually, if you do find a discrepancy, the licensee has to pay the cost of your audit. Another key issue that comes up in connection with license agreements is assignment, because licensees often feel like they want to be able to freely sub-license the licensed technology. Licensors like to have some degree of control over that process. Oftentimes, that conflict is resolved by having an assignment only be permitted with the written consent of the licensor. Now, that's a little different with respect to software licenses, because oftentimes software is sold under a license to its end user customers, and so if that's what you have, then obviously you need to build in provisions for the licensee to be able to actually market and sell its products. There you can have restrictions on further sub-licenses that prevent a wider dissemination of your IP than you had anticipated. Confidentiality is another consideration. Generally, these agreements have confidentiality provisions because there's always a risk that as your IP gets out there, it can be, the confidential aspects of it can be exposed. So, granting a license can generate rapid revenue for the licensor, can have guaranteed or minimum payments, can have variable payments based on revenues or profits of the licensee's business. It's just very often a much faster route to revenue. Keep in mind, the licensor, the owner of the IP, still owns the IP, and the license agreement should address whether the licensor retains the right to use the IP within the scope of the license, again, whether territorial or the industry. Oftentimes that's not addressed in sloppily prepared license agreements, and a licensee can find themselves, after investing heavily in a market, finding themselves competing with the licensor, because the licensor can elect to go into that business if it turns out that the licensed technology is successful, largely on the back of the efforts of a licensee. Also, particularly with trademark licenses, but also if you have developed a series of technologies and you want to start building brand credibility, you can require the licensee to disclose to users that it's your technology that the product is built around or branded with. So we'll try to spend a couple minutes on software as service agreements before we open it up to Q&A and wrap it up. Again, very common, more and more common with software. By 2017, we expect 35% of new software applications will be delivered under the SaaS model. What that means is a SaaS license is where the customer subscribes to the licensor's software as opposed to buys the right to use it. So it's nice from a business model standpoint, recurring revenues. SaaS license agreements are really essentially a hybrid between traditional software licenses and service agreements. So they can get a little complicated, especially in this day and age. In the SaaS relationship, the provider hosts the software, the service software, rather than physically delivering it either by disk or download. Access to the software is provided over the internet, and the SaaS provider is responsible for performing the operation, maintenance, and support of the software and the services. Obviously, data security is a big hot button source of contention nowadays and concern. Vendors usually offer to take reasonable security measures. Customers want vendors to commit to specific security specifications. and require that the vendors satisfy customer security policies. Vendors need to also be very careful not to get roped into absolute guarantees of data security. A lot of times, depending on the nature of the software, customer personal information is run through that software. Customers want the vendor to comply with all data privacy laws and not use their customer data except as explicitly authorized. Vendors want to be able to use that personal data to compile it, sometimes sell it and use it for other purposes, and need to be sure that their customers have obtained the consent of their users before processing that personal information. Vendors in SaaS agreements typically want their liability limited, oftentimes to no more than the amount of the subscription fees that they receive. Customers don't like that. And that's typically a negotiation. Been a negotiation in every SaaS license agreement I've done for the last few years. And usually it comes out somewhere in the neighborhood of the maximum subscription fees paid. Disaster recovery has been another hot button